I want to start off by telling you the the story of the most expensive piece of furniture in our house, and it's also the nicest piece of furniture in our house. Now, I will say, and if you have been to our home, you know this. Here's how I'll describe it. We have a cozy home, right? It's the home with which God has blessed us, and so we are grateful for it, but I'll say that it's cozy, and it gets cozier the more kids that come into the house, and the bigger those kids come, right? The home's getting cozier and cozier, but we're happy, we're content, and we love having the children run around most hours and most minutes of the day. You know how it goes. At any rate, this cozy home, it doesn't have like a dining room, and so our kitchen is kind of small. And so when we moved into the house, we knew that we were going to have to be very choosy. We needed a very specific table to fit into the space. We kind of wanted it to serve as a place that we could eat, and also kind of serve as a countertop when not eating on it. So we had to we looked and we looked and we looked and we looked online, and we just couldn't find exactly what we wanted. And then finally, my wife, she came across something on Facebook Marketplace, right? Facebook Marketplace. And so we go to get this table. We didn't have a truck. We didn't have the minivan at the time. And so it probably wouldn't have fit in the minivan. At any rate, we had to go to Menards or Home Depot and do one of those rent-the-truck deals. And then we drive, and we drive, and we drive, and we drive. And do you know what the burbs are? The suburbs, short for suburbs. Like, you know how there's the suburbs, and then there's the suburbs, and then there's the suburbs, and then there's the burbs. That's where we went to get this table. It was probably a 45-minute drive, and we drive up to this this massive, newly constructed house, and this is, in just I think maybe we've had the table for a year and a half or something like that. The lawn hasn't even been laid yet. Like, the closest neighbor is like 3 acres away, so that you don't have to say hi to them ever. And this person that we're interacting with, he's probably just making nice. He's just being friendly, and he was about our age, so a similar age. And he was a nice guy, and I'll say that. So I'm not, but what we came to realize as the conversation went on, just a number of things he said is, he was looking at us kind of like we were in the same station of life. He said, we told him, we just bought a house as well, and he said something to the extent of, us young people buying houses in today's market. And I thought to myself, good sir, your garage is about the same size as my house. We are not in the same tax bracket by any means. I don't know how many tax brackets there are, but we are probably several apart. And now again, he was being nice and no ill will towards him. But what I really want to focus on is that last part, thinking about brackets, right? There I'm talking about kind of a worldly fiscal thing, right? Different tax brackets, or we have different. It maybe is different in your life, like different position, and just maybe there's a hierarchy at work, right? This has to do with the 2 individuals that were introduced to in our parable for today, the Pharisee and the tax collector. Now, as far as the spiritual tax bracket, you might say, that they were in, the Pharisee, he was as high as you go. Spiritually, he was the elite individual of the day. From all outside view, from all the cultural standards of the day, this was the individual who had God's favor because he deserved it. He had worked for it, and he continued to work for it day in and day out. Now, as far as the tax collector, in fact, the Pharisees, they looked down on the tax collectors. One time when Jesus was eating with a group of people, the Pharisees come up to Jesus, or not to Jesus, they come up to his disciples and they say, what's your teacher doing eating with the sinners and tax collectors? So as far as the cultural norms for the day, the spiritual tax bracket for the sinners and tax collectors, there was no lower. It was the bottom, as low as you can go. And while that was how culture saw these 2 individuals, the world and the religious thought of the day, what Jesus does is challenge it. And he flips it on his head. And he says that what you see on the outside is not what's important, but rather it's what's going on in a person's heart that matters. It's what is going on in a person's heart that in God's eyes either puts them here or here. So let's get into our parable today. It's set up with these words: to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. To put it back on our minds, I'm going to go verse by verse, and we'll just kind of pause at each one and look at a few different things in the verse. Here, as I was thinking, I thought, if Jesus were around today and he had a crowd of people around him and he told this parable today, I wonder who he would have in mind. Who would this parable really be for? And we're going to see that this is one of the people it's really for is the Pharisees and those who are kind of in their league and in the same social circles as them. But who in today's world? I mean, certainly there's to use the illustration Jesus does, the religious person that has lost sight of grace. The religious person that thinks that by their own efforts they're holy or they're better or they're worthy. The person who's forgotten their deep need for God. But as I thought about who would this parable be pointed towards today, I think it goes beyond if we look into the secular world as well. Is not this the attitude of much of the world that we live in? For the politically charged, for the social justice warrior, for the championing of any cause. When we ourselves and the society around us gets too wrapped up in that, doesn't it make us do exactly this? To look down on that person over there? I think maybe what we finally have to land on is, while we can point and look in the world around us and in our specific context and say there are people all over the place who really need this parable, we need to look here, first and foremost. That it's my heart. How often, for whatever the circumstances may be, whatever the comparison that I'm making, don't I look down on somebody? Jesus starts the parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. We've already touched and drawn the picture out of just how completely different and completely opposite in completely different brackets the Pharisee and the tax collector were. So to look at those other two underlined sections, the 2 men went up. So just to give you kind of a visual picture of what's going on in your mind, which is how the listeners of this parable would have been thinking about it. I haven't gotten to go to Israel yet. I think it's on every pastor's bucket list, so God willing, someday I'll get to. But from what I understand, the temple was kind of at the high point of the city. And so you kind of ascended this mountain. So literally, you're not just kind of metaphorically going up into the presence of the high and holy God, but you're actually literally going up this hill as you ascend and go into the temple. And they were going to pray. What may have been on the minds of the original hearers of this parable is the fact that there were a couple different times every day when people that were set aside and designated for people to pray. So they would actually go at specific times and pray. Now you could go and pray outside those times, but and Jesus doesn't draw attention to this, but it's kind of interesting that these times that are designated for prayer, there were also sacrifices that were going on. And I just want to highlight that because it kind of brings a little more punch to some of the ironies that we're going to run into in just a minute. So here these men are, they've come to pray in God's temple, and there are literally sacrifices for sin that are happening. And yet we see 2 very different attitudes from these individuals. We see the Pharisee first. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed. You kind of get the sense, especially when you contrast what the Pharisee did with what the tax collector did, that the Pharisee positioned himself, and you can imagine the hearers of the day had probably seen this happen enough times that they could see it in their mind's eye. He positioned himself in probably a place where people could see him. And the norm back then was not to pray or to read silently like we do in our heads, but it was to pray, to read out loud. So he probably positions himself in a place where many, many eyes and many people can see him. And then he proceeds to pray this prayer out loud, almost certainly so that people could hear him. God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I give a tenth of all I get. Before I get to all the underlined sections here, just looking at those first two, pondering this, remembering that we're examining our own hearts today as we go through this parable. As I thought about it this past week, at least for me, that was the most convicting line. God, I thank you that I'm not like... And isn't that what it usually comes down to for you and I? Living in a day and age when we literally breathe comparison. We can't get online, we can't get on social media, we can't go to someone's house without doing it because it's so ingrained in us. And so we look for ways to tear other people down in our minds and build ourselves up, whatever that may be. Where are those places that you say? Where are those places that I say, thank God I'm not like them? And then to the rest of the underlined here, I just wanted to show you that there are 5 I's. One of them is an implied. It doesn't come across in the English translation we have here, but when you look back, it's, I thank you that I'm not like, I fast twice a week, I give a tenth of all I get. You see what that's getting at? It's not that you can't pray to God and say, and use I or me, but this prayer really isn't to God. This prayer is for the Pharisee. It's for him to build himself up, to show others how good he is. And as you see the I, Lord, I did it, I got it, I earned it, maybe a little help from you, God, thanks for that. What you come to see is what's less important than the actions, how the Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, and what's far more important, what God is concerned with, is what's in this Pharisee's heart. And what's in his heart? He doesn't need that sacrifice for sin that's happening right over there. He doesn't need God. He can do it himself. By contrast, we see the tax collector. The tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. The tax collector, by contrast, he doesn't want attention drawn to himself. You might imagine in your mind probably what happened was the Pharisee speaking out loud and maybe the tax collector muttering under his breath, not wanting to draw attention to himself, not wanting to be seen. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And it's interesting here, just to give you kind of some deeper, more profound shades of what's behind this word mercy. It's this fancy, rich theological term that we won't dig into too much today, but simply it's saying, God, be propitiated toward me, a sinner. And what that simply means is, God, turn your wrath away from me. The wrath and anger that I deserve because I am a sinner, because I do mess up. Lord, direct it elsewhere. Lord, I need you. Again, at the heart. That's what he's saying. It's, Lord, I'm not good on my own. I can't do it on my own. Lord, I need you and your mercy and your forgiveness. I am entirely dependent on it. So, to review, before we read the last verse, we're almost done here, but to review. You have the Pharisee. Spiritual tax bracket is as high as it goes for the day and age. And you have the tax collector. The spiritual bracket is as low as it gets. It can't be any more in the dirt. But that's not what God was looking at. That's what Jesus wanted people to see. He wasn't looking at the outward trappings. He wasn't looking at the actions. Actions are so much, they can tell a story. They tell part of the story here, but they're so much less important than what's right here in the heart. And because the Pharisee approached with a pompous attitude, a puffed up ego that said, God, I don't need you, I've got this, I made it. We're going to see what Jesus has to say about that in the last verse. And then you have the tax collector, who approaches with kind of the exact opposite attitude. And in God's eyes, because of the hearts of these two individuals, they're flipped. I tell you that this man, the tax collector, rather than the other, went home justified before God, forgiven for his sin. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. I would hope that today, as you and I ponder this parable, it would lead us not to think about actions. We're such an action-centric society. It's all we focus on. It's all we think about, how we look in front of other people, what we're doing, what other people see. I'd hope that this parable would lead you and I today to think about what's in our hearts. And as we dig and as we examine, to come to the right conclusion by the grace of God, that we're like that tax collector, fully dependent, fully in need of a Savior, fully in need of his mercy. Amen? Amen. Amen. If you have an offering,